Thanks, Jason. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So since the summer, we've had a Winterfell U-turn, a welfare U-turn, the Chancellor in tears in the Commons, the Chancellor failing to obtain a property licence, Angela Rayner's resignation, Mandelson being sacked, Andy Burnham on manoeuvres, briefings against Wes Streeting from Number 10, the sky full of kites being flown by Torsten Bell at the Treasury, and to top it all, the OBR cock-up yesterday. Is this government in absolute chaos, or is this just the ups and downs of politics in the 24/7 media age? It's all rather disappointing, but it's not altogether surprising. It's disappointing because I thought in Sakir we might benefit from the forensic mind of the expert prosecutor, a reasonable majority behind him to just get on with it. The grown-ups back in charge. But on reflection, it's not surprising. Keir came into politics late in life. It's well known he's forever been disinterested in the politics of politics itself. Questions of strategy and leadership, existential to his team, seem to be reduced by him to human resources. Everything process-driven, workshopped, focus grouped, as Nye Bevan might have said, a kind of desiccated calculating machine. But there are certain things you can't quantify. Certain things you need nous, instinct. One of those things is politics. The other is the economy. It's exactly what Maynard Keynes called the animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to act. Given he hasn't been able to project strength easily over his parliamentary party, that has been a problem. You need strength to lead your party, as we've seen in recent years. Without your party behind you, you can't lead the country. I think his MPs felt if they could push hard enough, they can shape what they wanted. And I think we saw a bit of that yesterday. And that's why we had the vacillating and the kite flying and the leaking. And that's why we ended up with the smorgasbord budget. A bit of a compromise between the markets and the backbenchers. The OBR presenting a picture of steady contraction in nominal terms. Having said that, I thought the Chancellor performed pretty well. She's bought herself and her boss a bit of time. But if they do manage to limp on until next year, and external factors, black swan events, do not intervene in the meantime, I think we'll be facing the same set of circumstances then too. On repeat, like the status quo, a deepening black hole, because that's how we got to where we got to yesterday. The first 5 months of this year, the government borrowed £84 billion, 16 billion more than the year before, and 11 billion more than planned. So without higher taxes or cuts, fiscal rules would not have been met. So in order to meet the rules and double last year's 10 billion inadequate headroom, pay for nearly 10 billion more of welfare spending, Rachel Reeves found 26 billion of higher taxes. And the smorgasbord is on the slide. Some of my colleagues will be getting into the weeds of that later today. Did she hit her brief? A lot's often made of the fiscal rules, only rules in the sense they can be bent by chancellors in terms of definition and, of course, the annual jam tomorrow exercise to push them out to the end of the final period presented. But here they are. The budget should be in surplus. They should only be borrowing for capital spending, and net debt should fall relative to the size of the economy. Mark in the homework. The rules were met. But as a colleague said to me yesterday, more spend and tax rather than tax and spend, the spending first and the tax later. The final year of the election is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in these rules, and the ever-optimistic OBR is something I'll come to shortly. We can give her a pass if we accept a slight fudge. But first, let's set the scene. In the spirit of human resources, I summarise the intractable pickle that the Chancellor found herself in as a kind of balanced scorecard. I have some sympathy for this predicament. She had to reassure the markets. Whatever Andy Burnham and that chap from the Green Party thinks, the markets call the shots. Debt is basically 100% of GDP, and that's just how it is when you are in hock. How to reassure the bond markets? Cut expenditure, but her MPs won't let her. Raise taxes, which is kryptonite for growth, or grow the economy. But the markets are pretty jaded with endless jam tomorrow growth stories. Secondly, she had to show the public that the cost of living pressures are being eased. How to demonstrate that? Reduce inflation or grow the economy. Keywords here then are incentives and productivity. We're back to animal spirits. Let's take the last 2 years. So autumn 2023 roughly coincides with the normalization of the gas shock in Europe, the Bank of England stopping its rate rising. You can think of this as the beginning of an economic cycle and almost 2 full business years. We had the manifesto promise, the election, last year's budget, which of course was a reset, which was not planned to be repeated, a warning from the Chancellor earlier in the month around broad shoulders and all that, and then yesterday a repeat of last year, albeit 26 billion rather than 40 billion of tax rises. But what has the economy actually done during this period? Not exactly stagnation, more like a slow puncture. Stagnation means not moving, so it's the wrong word. GDP is moving, but what's important is to understand how it's moving. This is the ONS's monthly real GDP estimates from November 23 to the latest available actuals, normalized at 100 at the beginning of the period. If you do the sums, you get overall annualized growth since November 2023 of 1.4% per year. So it's not stagnation. But before we start hanging out the bunting, it's what's underlying that growth that's important. And what's underlying that is a big expansion in government spending and a big decline in cyclical sectors of the economy. Things like housing construction, big capital expenditure, durable good expenditure. Some of you will also be thinking about, what about GDP per capita? And you'd be right to be thinking that. That has been absolutely stagnant. The ratio of output to population essentially unchanged in the period. But the puzzle is the rising level of non-participation as much as stagnating levels of economy. I think of this as kind of a Greg's economy, which is a business very close to my own heart. Steady state for most workers, people paying their bills, buying the occasional steak bake, basically ticking over, but with a growing element of the population not participating in the economy. That cyclical bit of the economy, the bit that markets really look forward to because businesses need to react by raising capital, is completely missing in action. So overall, a slow puncture right at the beginning of an economic cycle. What we heard yesterday is that the OBR expects the slow puncture to continue. 1.5% real GDP growth outturn this year, and basically that for the remainder of the forecast period. And remember that the OBR is ever optimistic. I think there are 2 things to blame. Firstly, the fiscal policy makers and the wonks, including the Bank of England, who are seemingly lacking the basic credibility to get benchmark interest rates to where the economic fundamentals say they should be. I think this is at the heart of the issue. And secondly, the government seems to struggle to deal with non-participation, the health epidemic, the jobless youth, and the integration of new migrants in the workforce. On that first point, where should the benchmark interest rates be? Now, I think of the UK as kind of a mid-Atlantic economy geographically, but in its behavior, it's sort of mid-Atlantic as well. Not quite as sclerotic as the Eurozone, but not quite as swashbuckling as the USA. Growing faster than the Eurozone, but not as fast as the USA. Perhaps because of these reasons, in historical terms, the UK 10-year bond has sat right in the middle of the two. And you can see that from the beginning of the chart a couple of years ago. The US is brown, the UK green, Germany is blue. Today, the US is at 4%, Germany 2.7%, and we're at 4.5%. We should be more like 3.5%. The maths here is the Bank of England has a 2% inflation target, and the market knows there's real forecast growth of around 1.5%. So we're 100 points adrift. The market either doesn't believe inflation will get under control, or it doesn't believe any growth will ensue. It's like a UK risk premium. And this affects all of us. Business valuations are lower. It costs more to borrow money. And I think this is the reason why we don't have that cherry on the top. We don't have the momentum behind the cyclical economy, building, investing, and developing. This, together with the inflation from the last budget, has validated market expectations that the UK is still not an economy that commits itself to sound money. So this comes back to reining in expenditure and dealing with productivity, which is my non-participation point. Now, you'll have heard this in previous presentations. Productivity has long been an issue. This is a 10-year-old chart after the financial crisis. The reasons put forward at the time for the puzzle were all around levels of capital investment, over-reliance on cheap labor, banks' appetite for lending, people working beyond normal retirement age, things like that. If that 2007 trend had continued, productivity would have been 16% higher than it actually turned out to be. So we've lagged the world in productivity for a long time. But since the 2008 crisis, and coming out of another crisis you might remember in 2020, there's another trend emerging. The Greg's economy becoming the welfare economy. Part of this is baked in, steak baked in, given the aging population and kind of an unwillingness to address the triple lock, but part of it is not. Health and disability benefits heading to 100 billion, 6.5 million on out-of-work benefits. 20 people on active contracts with the mobility scheme for constipation. 320 people for dyslexia. I'm not making any specific comment on all of this. All I'm saying is that sooner or later, the bond market will hold us over a barrel if it's not sorted. And as you can see from the FT data extract there, the main risk is that capital finds its way to more productive places. The OBR report yesterday shows welfare spending 24-25 exceeding income tax receipts by 2.9%. So all the income tax and more is spent on welfare spending, unsustainably high. So I'm suggesting it's not a productivity puzzle after all. The evidence is the UK is particularly bad at responding to shocks like the global financial crisis or COVID. It also suggests that the system is structurally unsustainable. And that gets me back to where I started, animal spirits and Keynes's words, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction. This is what needs to be turned around by government, or it will be turned around by the bond market. So where do we go from here? Will we see that exceptional event, that black swan? When will we see it? Will it be good? Will it be bad? So just indulge me for a couple of minutes. Let's start with a bad bird. All of us have lived through a fiscal event when the gilt market gets very concerned and yields rise very rapidly. Think Liz Truss. I've already said I think that bond yields are 100 points over where they should be, and I believe the market more than the government and the Bank of England. With Truss, they went up 100 points in 4 days, and the Bank of England had to intervene. The European sovereign debt crisis, there was a series of similar events. They are uncommon, but they do happen. I think the government's now had 2 goes at setting out its fiscal plans. And there's a basic rule of nature which seems to hold. 3 strikes and you are out. We've proven that the bond markets are on red alert. They're alive to the UK. They're watching us like hawks. The problem is, for the first 5 months of this fiscal year, spending overshot tax revenue by 16 billion, 3 billion a month. If that run rate continues, 40 billion overspend for the year. The OBR have said they're expecting revenues to pick up and spending to slow, but the OBR are always over-optimistic. So the question is, what if spending doesn't slow? What if tax revenues don't increase? What happens if we keep spending at the same rate as we did? It's just arithmetic. It's not a forecast, but the deficit could be closer to 180 billion, not the 140 billion. These imbalances can build up, not be a problem, not be a problem, not be a problem, and then kaboom, suddenly it turns. And when it turns, it happens much faster than anyone expects. The Bank of England intercedes, massive rate rises, products get withdrawn, stock market reacts. I don't know when it will happen. I wouldn't be here if I did. But we can say that about 100 basis points will probably be sufficient to cause something like that. So keep an eye on bond yields. And now you know why I bore you all with them all the time on LinkedIn. On the other hand, what if things are positive? What if we have a good bird? I've been thinking about China. China has this demographic dilemma, sort of a rapidly aging population, declining birth rate. The yuan is pegged to the dollar, so exports keep businesses running. It's deflating, and it's pushing capacity outwards. Factories are cutting sticker prices, and businesses are trying to keep up by sheer force of supply in an oversupplied market. And it owns all that US debt, about $1 trillion. So we might find aspects of the regime problematic, but we are in a prime geopolitical place to benefit from imported Chinese inflation and ease our own fiscal pressures. We've seen the moves to this end with the embassy in London and the soft treatment of the 2 alleged spies. And then in the longer term, That could really be transformational. What about AI? Intelligent machines and cyborgs and unenhanced human beings peacefully coexisting. Industrial productivity no longer constrained by scarce human labor. Even those remaining Luddite human beings like me might be able to sell our houses for more productive things to more productive robots in exchange for a perpetual annuity. Something like that could happen. Who knows? It's food for thought. Either way, keep in mind, Rome was not destroyed in a day. And remember, there's nothing new in all of this. During the American Revolution, Adam Smith said, "Be assured, my young friend, there's a great deal of ruin in a nation." It was his way of saying that things would work out fine in the end. And indeed, they did. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce my partner, Graham Doubtfire, who will be speaking about personal tax and getting into the weeds.